we continue our study of the Pentateuch, specifically the book of Genesis. We are in Genesis, the 40th chapter. Now remember what happened in chapter 39. Joseph had been betrayed by Potiphar's wife. Potiphar's wife had continually come on to him, wanting him to lie with her. He refused. He told her, how can I do this great sin against God? And then she tried to get him when he was alone in the house. And he literally ran. He literally fled from fornication. Left his coat behind. She claimed that he had taken advantage of her. And so Potiphar had no choice, having no evidence to the contrary, but to throw him in prison. Now, the prison that Joseph had been thrown into at the end of chapter 39 is a prison that was a step above the common prison. In other words, this isn't something like you would see the Apostle Paul be thrown into in the first century, where he's in just the depths of a dank dungeon where there's nothing at all that's supporting him. He is in what we would consider, in our parlance, sort of a Hilton-type prison. Not in the sense that he had it easy, mind you, but it was a lot better in the people that were in the prison and the way they were treated than common criminals and murderers and whatnot. You're going to see that here in chapter 40 because of the people that are in prison with Joseph. Now, let's be clear. Joseph was still being persecuted. Joseph was falsely imprisoned. Joseph didn't have it easy whatsoever, but it could have been far worse. Potiphar could very well have ordered him to be executed if he had been of a mind. But as we mentioned last week, Potiphar likely had been down this road before with his wife. This is not the first time likely that this has happened. The difference with this is she has, quote, evidence, end quote. She has his coat. So to save face, perhaps, for himself, and to do something about this situation, he throws him in prison. Now, as we go through these next two chapters, there's going to be a few tidbits that are going to shed some more light on Potiphar's behavior, and perhaps some of the things that were going on behind the scenes that Moses doesn't explicitly mention in chapter 39. Having said that, let's get into chapter 40. It says, "Then it came about after these things." We're not told by Moses how much time has passed between the time that he was thrown into prison and the events of chapter 40. Some period of time has passed. "The cupbearer and the baker for the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt." The cupbearer and the baker. These two men held high, risky positions. The cupbearer. Why would that be a risky position? Because there would be people trying to poison the king. They tried to slip something in his drink to kill him. That was very common in the ancient world. In fact, it's very interesting when you look at the number of pharaohs that died or were killed under very strange circumstances. And most of the time we think that they had been poisoned. The cupbearer held a very important position. The baker also held a very important position. What a king ate could very well be tainted with something that would kill him. So these two men were in key positions, and both of these men found themselves in prison. And who's with him? Joseph. Verse 2, Pharaoh was furious, the New American Standard Bible says, with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. He's furious with them. Moses doesn't tell us why. He just says the circumstance as to why they're there. Pharaoh's fury was directed at these two men. Then in verse 3, Moses says, "So he put them in confinement," watch this, "in the house of the captain of the bodyguard, in the jail, the same place where Joseph was imprisoned." The captain of the bodyguard. Where have we seen that phrase? Back up to chapter 39, verse 1. Potiphar, an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the bodyguard. That's not circumstantial. That's not accidental, Moses putting that in. Notice, they are in confinement in the house of the captain of the bodyguard. That's Potiphar. That's Potiphar's house. In the jail, the same place where Joseph was imprisoned. So what had Potiphar done? Potiphar had thrown Joseph in jail, which, oh, by the way, is there at the house of Potiphar. What does that tell you about the trust that Potiphar still has in Joseph? Even though he had to do something, he had to save face, obviously, because the evidence, quote unquote, was there. So what did he do? He puts him in jail. And now notice, verse 4, the captain of the bodyguard, Moses once again doesn't say Potiphar, but it's strongly implied, put Joseph in charge of them. Notice that. He put Joseph in charge. Now, why did he do that, reckon? And he took care of them, and they were in confinement for some time. So he put Joseph in charge, the captain of the bodyguard, if that is Potiphar, and there's no reason to believe it's not. Potiphar still had that much faith and trust in Joseph as to what he could do. He puts Joseph once again in a position of authority. Just as he had been over everything in Potiphar's house, now where does he end up? Over all of the prison. Then the cupbearer and the baker for the king of Egypt, who were confined in jail, both had a dream the same night. Each man with his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. So now here we go with the dreams again. These two men have a dream. When Joseph came to them in the morning and observed them, behold, they were dejected. He asked Pharaoh's officials who were with him in confinement in his master's house. Notice this, Pharaoh's officials are there with Joseph in confinement in the master's house. That's Potiphar's house. That's Potiphar's prison. And Joseph has direct communication or indirect communication with the king of Egypt. Why are your faces so sad today? They said to him, we have had a dream and there is no one to interpret it. Then Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell it to me, please. The source of interpretations of dreams belong to Jehovah, is what he's saying. So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, in my dream, behold, there was a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. And as it was budding, its blossoms came out, and its clusters produced ripe grapes. Now Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, so I took the grapes and squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. Then Joseph said to him, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office. And you will put Pharaoh's cup into his hand, according to your former custom when you were his cupbearer. Only keep me in mind when it goes well with you. And please do me a kindness by mentioning me to Pharaoh and get me out of this house. For I was, in fact, kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing that they should have put me into the dungeon. Joseph has confidence that if Pharaoh knows about his situation, that Pharaoh will get him out. Now, would he have had that much confidence if the Pharaoh had been a native-born Egyptian? Probably not. But as we mentioned last week, likely the Pharaoh that was in place during this period of time was from the Hyksos dynasty. The Hyksos ruled for 2 dynasties in Egypt. They were a foreign-based group that came in and invaded Egypt and overthrew the Egyptians, drove them out, and then established their own dynasties for a period of time. That was the time likely when Joseph rose up in his prominence. He couldn't have done it at any other point in Egyptian history. But he has that much faith in Pharaoh that he will do that. Verse 16. When the chief baker saw that he had interpreted favorably, he said to Joseph, I also saw in my dream. And behold, there were 3 baskets of white bread on my head. And in the top basket there were some of all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh. And the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. Then Joseph answered and said, this is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and will hang you on a tree. And the birds will eat your flesh off of you. What an interpretation. That's typical Hebrew humor. Hebrew humor sort of gets a little bit sarcastic and sort of gets a little bit a play on words. So Joseph had already told the chief cupbearer, your head's going to be lifted up. And now he tells the baker, yeah, your head's going to be lifted up off of you, and you're going to be hanged. What an interpretation for that. Verse 20, thus it came about on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all his servants. And he lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his office, and he put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, just as Joseph had interpreted to him. Just as Joseph had said, this dream comes to pass exactly as he had foretold. Yet, verse 23 tells us, the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Human nature. Joseph had said, now remember me when this happens. You remember me to Pharaoh. Mention what I've gone through. Well, in his delight at being restored to his office, at being released from prison, this man forgets. He forgets Joseph. And so that leads us into chapter 41, the events that are going to take place, which are remarkable in many ways, but not so remarkable when you consider the character of Joseph. He was a man of extremely high character. Any questions, comments before we get into chapter 41, before we move into it? Chapter 41 then begins, now it happened at the end of 2 full years. This is one of the few times that Moses mentions the period of time that have passed. So from the time the chief cupbearer is restored back to his position and the events of chapter 41, you've got 2 full years that intervene. Now, would that get someone down? He's sitting there, Joseph is waiting for word from Pharaoh, and it never comes. It never comes. It never comes. That would discourage anyone. And I'm sure it discouraged Joseph at first. But Joseph had his trust in the Lord, and it was about to come to fruition. It happened at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream. There's another dream. And behold, he was standing by the Nile. You remember from your world history class in high school and college that the Nile River was the source of the fertility of Egypt. The Nile River, of course, runs from south to north. So the upper Nile is at the southern edge and the lower Nile is at the northern edge. Counterintuitive to the way we think. The Nile River is the longest river in the world. And it was the source of everything from Egypt. And in their spiritual life, their pantheon of gods, they said the Nile was the source of everything that was living. So he's standing by the Nile in his dream, verse 2. And lo, from the Nile there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat. And they grazed in the marsh grass. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them from the Nile, ugly and gaunt. And they stood by the other cows in the bank of the Nile. The ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 sleek and fat cows. Then Pharaoh awoke. Would that get your attention? If I had a dream like that, that would wake me up in a hurry. I've had some weird dreams. I'm sure you have had too. But if you had a dream like this one, you'd wake up quickly. So, verse 5 says, he fell asleep. So, he falls back asleep. And dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain came up on a single stalk, plump and good. Then behold, 7 ears thin and scorched by the east wind sprouted up after them. The thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump and full ears. Then Pharaoh awoke And behold, surprise, Moses says, but surprise, it was a dream. It was so vivid, he thought it was real, and then he wakes up. You know, you've had that dream where you're flying. You remember, you've had the dream before, I'm sure, where you're either falling off or you're flying, and it's so real, and all of a sudden you wake up, oh, it was just a dream. Well, Pharaoh, same experience. Behold, Moses says, it was a dream. Now in the morning his spirit was troubled. So he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them to Pharaoh. This theme of an official, a king or someone who's had a dream that could not be interpreted and magicians could not interpret, that's going to be repeated throughout the Old Testament. And this, of course, has significance in, say, Daniel's case, when you skip down to the prophetic era, where Nebuchadnezzar has his dreams, and Daniel is the one who interprets them. So, this happens with him. Verse 9 says, Then the chief cupbearer spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I would make mention today of my own offenses. Why does he say that? His memory is now started. Pharaoh's dreaming. Oh, yes, now I remember. Verse 10, Pharaoh was furious with his servants, and he put me in confinement in the house of the captain of the bodyguard, both me and the chief baker. We had a dream on the same night, he and I. Each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now, a Hebrew youth was with us there, a servant of the captain of the bodyguard. Who is the captain of the bodyguard? Potiphar. He's still being mentioned by Moses, even after the events of chapter 39. And we related them to him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each one he interpreted according to his own dream. And just as he interpreted for us, so it happened. He restored me in my office, but he hanged him. Then Pharaoh sent and called for Joseph. And they hurriedly brought him out of the dungeon. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came to Pharaoh. Now you can picture in your mind, Joseph's hair is grown, he's got a thick beard and mustache. You know, he hasn't had a true bath in 2 years. He's got to clean himself up before he goes to Pharaoh. So he makes sure everything is as it should be with him before he goes before him. Now, Moses is going to mention later on that Joseph at this point is 30 years old. It's been 13 years since he was sold into slavery by his brothers. Do you think he's changed in his appearance a little bit? Oh yeah, he's changed. He's grown. He's no longer that young, thin teenager that had been with his brothers out in the field. No, he's now a hardened, tanned, most likely, older young man who now is going to appear before the Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, but no one can interpret it. And I have heard it said about you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Now, something that Moses doesn't really mention explicitly here, which is strongly implied in what the cupbearer had said to Pharaoh, is that there has been a death of that former Pharaoh in the 2 years that intervened. Because notice how the cupbearer said it. He spoke to Pharaoh, verse 9, and then he says in verse 10, Pharaoh was furious with his servants. Why would he say that if this was the same Pharaoh? Wouldn't he say, you were furious with your servants? No. He says Pharaoh had to have been the Pharaoh before. There's been a change in the kingship, in other words. There's been another Pharaoh that has arisen. So, Pharaoh says, I have had a dream, no one can interpret it. I have heard it said about you that when you hear a dream, you can't interpret it. Joseph then answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Just like Daniel many, many years later. Daniel says the Lord is the one who will interpret this. Joseph says this. God is the one that will do it. So Pharaoh spoke to Joseph. In my dream, behold, I was standing on the bank of the Nile, and behold, 7 cows, fat and sleek, came out of the Nile, and they grazed the marsh grass. Lo, 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and gaunt, such as I had never seen for ugliness in all the land of Egypt. He said, I've never seen cows that ugly before in my life. Can you imagine that? The Lord knew just how to affect Pharaoh in that dream. And the lean and ugly cows ate up the first 7 fat cows. Yet when they had devoured them, it could not be detected that they had devoured them, for they were just as ugly as before. That's humorous to us, but it was vivid to Pharaoh. Pharaoh still was seeing this in his head. Then I awoke. I saw also in my dream, behold, 7 ears full and good came up on a single stalk, and those 7 ears, withered, thin, and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up after them. And the thin ears swallowed the 7 good ears. Then I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. The magicians of Egypt were very significant in the sense that they had authority, spiritual authority, and they had authority with Pharaoh, because they believed, of course, in the pantheon of gods and goddesses of Egypt. And so the magicians had Pharaoh's ear. And when the magicians couldn't figure out something, then it was a serious matter indeed. Verse 25. Now Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dreams are one and the same. God has told to Pharaoh what he is about to do. If the Lord says a thing once, it's important. If it says a thing twice, you need to stand up and pay attention. That's what he's telling Pharaoh. This is sure. It's going to happen. The 7 good cows are 7 years. And the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one and the same. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years. And the 7 thin ears, scorched by the east wind, will be 7 years of famine. It is as I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. God has shown to you what he's about to do. Behold, 7 years of great abundance are coming in all the land of Egypt. And after them 7 years of famine will come. And all the abundance will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will ravage the land. So the abundance will be unknown in the land because of that subsequent famine, for it will be very severe. Now, as for the repeating of the dream to Pharaoh twice, it means that the matter is determined by God, and God will quickly bring it about. In other words, time is of the essence. This is happening. It's going to happen suddenly. It's going to start playing out very soon. You got to do something, in other words, what he's telling you. Now look at verse 33. Now let Pharaoh look for a man discerning and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Joseph now is going to boldly propose to Pharaoh a decisive solution. Here's the problem. Now here's a solution that you can use. Now, verse 34 he says, let Pharaoh take action to appoint overseers in charge of the land, and let him exact 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 years of abundance. Then let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming, and store up the grain for food in the cities under Pharaoh's authority, and let them guard it. Now the cities are natural storage containers in the land of Egypt. That's what Joseph knows. He's been in Egypt long enough. He's surveyed the situation as much as he can. He knows how things operate in the land of Egypt. He knows how best to solve the situation. So, verse 36, let the food become as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine, which will occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land will not perish during the famine. And then Moses says, now the proposal seemed good to Pharaoh and all his servants. Now that's good. That's good in and of itself that Pharaoh hears what Joseph proposes. He talks it over with the servants, those that are under his authority. They say, that's a good proposal. But there's something more. Verse 38. Then Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this in whom is a divine spirit? Now, we're not seeing the video of this. We don't have the DVD of how this looked. All we've got is what Moses describes, which you can picture in your mind. Pharaoh is talking to his servants, and he gestures over to Joseph. Joseph is standing there in front of them. Can we find a man like this? He's pointing to Joseph. We don't see Joseph's facial reaction. I'm sure that Joseph might have been pleasantly surprised at Pharaoh's gesturing toward him or indicating that he would be the one. Then, verse 39, so Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has informed you of all this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you are. That is a huge compliment to Joseph. Far more than just a compliment. Yes, sir. In addition to the pantheon of gods and goddesses, I would go so far as to say that Pharaoh would acknowledge that your God is a God. I don't think that Pharaoh was anywhere near saying your God is the God. But he would acknowledge that your God is deity. In other words, you have the spirit of a God, he would say, probably. But he wasn't ready to say there's only one God and let's get rid of all the other gods and goddesses. He just acknowledged that the power of Joseph's God was evident. He wasn't going to deny what was clear. And so he's talking to his wise men, and he says to him that there is no one so discerning and wise as you are. Now, how did the magicians think when he said that? The magicians, I'm sure, were shocked when Pharaoh said this. They're supposed to be the wisest men of all of Egypt. And here's this Hebrew that comes in who interprets his dreams and no one else can, and now he's being indicated as the one who is most discerning and wise. Then he says, you shall be over my house, and according to your command all my people shall do homage only in the throne. I will be greater than you. That's a stunner. That is a shock to Joseph. And that would be a shock to anyone who knew the comings and goings of Egyptian authority and government. But because this likely was the Hyksos dynasty in charge, this was very possible. If it had been native-born Egyptians on the throne and in command, Joseph would not have been anywhere near this kind of position. But because you had foreigners that were in control, this was able to take place. He is being made, Joseph is, a grand vizier, V-I-Z-I-E-R, a grand vizier, which is an extremely powerful position in Egypt. Second in command, only answerable to Pharaoh. Think about this thing. Joseph, just 13 years ago, had been sold into slavery by his brothers. He had been put into Potiphar's house in a strange land, not knowing what he's going to do. He's betrayed. He is accused of a crime he didn't commit, thrown into prison. He's there for several years, doesn't know what's going to happen, and now look at where he is. He is at the very cusp of being second in command over the world's largest superpower. Yes, Egypt was a superpower at this point. Second in command. Notice verse 42. Then Pharaoh took off his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand. Now, what's the significance of the signet ring? The signet ring is the seal. To seal important documents, legal documents, that's the imprimatur of Pharaoh. He gives his personal signet ring to Joseph. But that's not all. Clothed him in garments of fine linen and put the gold necklace around his neck. Symbolic of authority, this gold necklace. He's giving him the symbols of authority, the symbols of power. The signet ring to seal important documents, legal documents, and the chain symbolizing the authority, the power that he held, that he would hold. Yes, sir?
This shows too that by this time Joseph had learned how to read and write.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. He had been educated, of course, in his father's house, but even more, he'd gotten the Egyptian education. I'm certain, even though Moses doesn't say it to us, he likely had an education under Potiphar's house. Potiphar showed so much kindness to him, he likely had educated him in the ins and outs of Egyptian government and, of course, Joseph's own observance. But by this point, he's 30 years old. Joseph is well versed in it. He knows. And all of this given to him at this point in his life, he is in a position where he can do much, much, much good. Verse 43, it doesn't end there. He had him ride in his second chariot. What's the second chariot? The second chariot is the chariot of the grand vizier. It's the chariot that's right behind Pharaoh's. When they would have the grand processionals, Pharaoh would be right there at the head, Joseph would be right behind him in the grand vizier's chariot. And they proclaim before him, bow the knee. Do you think that Joseph possibly thought about the dream that he had back when he was 17 years old, where there would be people bowing to him? Oh, yeah. You know he had to have thought about it. And he set him over all the land of Egypt. Here is this Hebrew who's now second in command. Second in command. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, though I am Pharaoh, yet without your permission no one shall raise his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. I've got 5 exclamation points written by that statement. No one will do anything without your approval. Does that sound to you like Joseph is being forced into this position? Oh, no. Pharaoh was willingly giving it to him, and Joseph was willingly going to take it. Then Pharaoh named Joseph Zaphanath-Paneah. Where in the world does that name come from? Well, Zaphanath, if you look at the definition of it, some would say that it means God speaks or he lives. He's acknowledging, Pharaoh is, that the God of Joseph speaks and that he lives. Zaphanath-Paneah. And notice this, he gave him Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, as his wife. Potipharah. Do you think she had a connection to Potiphar? Oh, yes. There's that strong connection still between Potiphar and Moses. Potiphar and Joseph. Even after the events of chapter 39, Potiphar is still helping Joseph behind the scenes. And Asenath is the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. On was the center of the worship of the sun god in Egypt. That's going to be important many years later. After Moses and the Israelites had left the land of Egypt, after all that had taken place, there will arise a Pharaoh who would say that the only god of Egypt is the sun god, Aten. And so this is where that worship was centered, in On. Do you think that Joseph possibly had an influence? I think he did. I think he did to a certain extent. And Joseph went forth over the land of Egypt. Think about how Joseph must have felt. He's got the official garments on. He's wearing the signet ring. He's got the chain around his neck. He's in the chariot right behind Pharaoh. And as he's going down to those processionals, those official visits to all these cities, think about what must have been going through his mind. 13 years ago, I was in a strange land. I didn't know anyone. And now I'm here. You know, if Joseph had been a man of low character, this could have really affected him greatly in a bad way. Sometimes when individuals get positions of power, it affects them in a negative way. Joseph wasn't like that. Joseph was a man of good character. He wanted to follow the Lord in everything he was doing, and it showed. Notice verse 46. Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. A 30-year-old young man. Second in command over all of Egypt. That ought to give encouragement to the young men and young women that are among us, that they can accomplish great, great things. Yes, sir. Connected to it. Not necessarily his daughter, but connected to her. Yeah. Pharaoh would give that indication. In other words, there's some kind of connection, whether it's daughter, whether if it's kin, or whatever connection is there, it's obvious in the name, Pharaoh. So even though Moses doesn't go into detail about it, there is that connection there. So there's some way that Potiphar's still having some impact behind the scenes on behalf of Joseph in a positive way. So he says there in verse 46 that Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. Joseph, again, let's repeat, Joseph could not have held this position under native-born Egyptians. There had been no way. They did not allow foreigners to have any kind of position of authority. The only way that Joseph could have held this position was a foreigner on the throne. And that's exactly what was taking place. The Hyksos dynasty was fully in command, and so Joseph was able to be second in command over all of Egypt. Verse 47, during the 7 years of plenty, the land brought forth abundantly. So he gathered all the food of these 7 years, which occurred in the land of Egypt, and placed the food in the cities. He placed in every city the food from its own surrounding fields. Thus Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he stopped measuring it. For it was beyond measure. Just like his dream foretold, just like the Lord had predicted. The plenty, the abundance of the land just overflows until you can't even continue to measure it. You can't continue to give it any kind of quantitative level. Verse 50. Now before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bore to him. By the way, the name On also is the name Heliopolis. It's also known as Heliopolis, which would have reference to the sun, by the way. So, verse 51 says that Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh. The word Manasseh means making to forget. And so he said, God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. So this baby is born, Manasseh. He's making me forget all the trouble I've been through up to this point, forgetting it. And he says, all my father's household. Could it be by this point that Joseph has given up on his brothers coming to see how he was doing, or perhaps coming to try to rescue him? Could it be that he already thinks that Israel is dead? That he thinks that no hope from ever returning back to the land of his forefathers? We're not told. He just says, God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. Verse 52, he named the second Ephraim. Ephraim means fruitfulness. For he said, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Fruitfulness. Not only is he second in command, not only does he have all this power and authority, he is now married, and he now has 2 beautiful baby boys. He's made me fruitful. When the 7 years of plenty, which had been in the land of Egypt, came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, just as Joseph had said, then there was famine in all the lands. That includes Palestine, by the way, includes Canaan. But in all the land of Egypt there was bread. So when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried out to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph. Whatever he says to you, you shall do. He's emphasizing the fact, Joseph's the one in charge of this. You go to him. He's the one that you go see about it. When the famine was spread over all the face of the earth, then Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians. And the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. The people of all the earth came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe in all the earth. Now look at where Joseph is. Joseph is not only second in command over the entire land of Egypt, he now has control to a certain extent over all the earth. That is to say, he's the one that determines who gets food. This young man in this kind of position is tremendous. And this is going to lead us, when we get into chapter 42, into one of the most tremendous stories that you will ever read anywhere. Beginning in chapter 42, going on through several chapters, you're going to see this drama play out, this family drama play out. And you're going to see why the Israelites love this story and why the Israelites love Joseph. If you don't get moved by what we're about to go into, I feel sorry for you because you can't be moved. But anyway, we'll get there once we get there. And we'll start into chapter 4.